Welcome to the New York City PowerShell meetup. My name is Doug Fink and I'm your host. And tonight we're going to hear Phil Bossman talk about core concepts, making sense of functions. And before we get started, also want to take a look at next month in the new year. We're going to have Richard Benwell and Sean Williams. They're going to show their product Squared Up, which is how you can visualize PowerShell data. So I'm pretty excited about that as well. And we'll see how the rest of next year fleshes out in terms of speakers. If you'd like to speak, send me an email, get in touch with me. I'm on Twitter. My email's out there as well. You can reach me on Meetup. You don't have to do any long presentation. If you want to do a 5 or 10 minute presentation about a project you're working on, get experience about speaking in front of a crowd or to a crowd, this is a great place to do it. Love to have new speakers, give them an opportunity to wet their feet and check out how it is to do presentations. So get in touch with me. If you know somebody that wants to speak, another way to let me get their name, or if there's a speaker you'd like to see, let me know that as well. So tonight, Phil's gonna do we're coming here to do a walk through building your first function, discuss the parts of a function, how to use them, and ways to effectively use the function to accomplish your goals. And also discuss creating advanced functions and how they can improve your scripts. Phil is a PowerShell enthusiast with a passion for learning, and he's currently a Citrix architect and end user computing expert in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. And he's co-organizer of the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. I suggest you check that out as well. I've spoken at their group, which was great. They have a great community. And they actually did a lightning rounds the other week where folks got on and had 10 minutes to present about a project or an idea or something they were running into. And it was a really fun time. And they let me present on that as well. It was a really great experience. So highly recommend it. So Phil, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right.
So with that, I'm going to kick over to you and take the presentation. If you have questions, post them in the chat. We'll be watching that. And we'll get those questions to Phil. We'll interrupt them as he goes. And hope you enjoy the evening.
All right. All right. And I will take the screen. And I think that's the right screen. Right? That's the right screen.
There we go. Start. Looks good.
All right. That's my thing. All right. Well, good evening. And thanks for joining us or joining me. Name is Phil Bossman. I am a PowerShell enthusiast. I've been doing this for quite some time now. My day job is a Citrix architect in the Raleigh area. Kind of more about me. Again, I've been doing PowerShell a long time. I have written 2 chapters in the PowerShell conference book. So I wrote one in volume 2 about PS Graph. So actually PS Graph is not like Microsoft Graph, but it's more like visualization graph. And then in volume 3 is I actually did similar to this topic is actually most of core concepts is like getting started and the lessons to learn when you first start. So the PowerShell conference book is a really great book. If you're looking for, there's 3 versions. We're working on a 4th at this point. And basically, it's all the different things. It's like you're going to a conference with all the different types of talks and genres and everything. And so it's just all in chapter form. So it's like 30, 40 chapters, all about different things. And so those are that. Again, like Doug had said, I am one of the leaders of the Research Triangle PowerShell user group here in the Raleigh area. We meet twice a month, and past 2 years we've done continuously meetings. We're on YouTube, we have a website. I'm on Twitter. I have a GitHub account and I have a website. I haven't posted there in a long time, but I'm hoping to do that some more. So, but if you get a hold of me in PowerShell anything, certainly reach out to me on Twitter and go from there. All right, so let's get into what we're talking about here. There we go. All right, making sense of functions. So ultimately here, the assumption is that, you kind of know what a function is, and at that point, so we want to get to this idea of what is a function, okay, and then I want to explore the power of a PowerShell function. So, and then we're going to go full deep dive. So I think it's going to go pretty slow at first, but then we're going to ramp up into full steam ahead. And I hope I don't, go beyond everybody's thoughts here. So I'm stealing some stuff from Doug as well. I'm gonna actually run this whole thing in a interactive notebook so that I can actually scroll and we can do some markup and it's be kind of fun stuff. So basically we're start off with basically what's a function. Functions are basically you want to combine your code into multiple parts. Okay, so if you have some just random thing that you want to write, but you want to do it repetitively or you want to organize your code, you basically create a function for that. And in different languages, it's all constructed in different ways. Ooh, wow, I think I can drag it. So in VBScript, this is the same thing. You define the word function, you give it a name, some parameter list, and then just keep on writing it till you get to the end function. That's how you write it in VB. All right. And hey, if you're gonna write some old batch stuff, again, a lot of people are Windows people, so they can write functions in batch. Hey, you start off with this fame, and then you can just call and go back to your function as what you want. Even people in Python, well, here it is. Python's very space aware. So long as you don't come back and you reverse indenting, then hey, your function has been defined. But it's just define, give it a function name, give it some parameters, do some declarations, and then just keep on writing statements. So with PowerShell, it's slightly different, and that's why I like the power of PowerShell. It has its own structure for functions, but it's very fluid in the form that it can be as complex as you want it to be, but it can also be as very simple as you want it to be. So all of this structure that you kind of see at this point. So there is a function name, there's a scope thing we kind of talk about, but here's that function name that you see up above. But then, hey, you can do this parameter sets like you did like over there. There's this binding thing we'll talk about. Then also there's a param block, it's a dynamic param block, begin, process, and end. So I'm going to come back to this format multiple times as we go along. I'm going to reinforce that because one of the things that you should understand, or at least it really helps me understand when I'm working with functions and understanding how the flow is things are working, is to remember this flow, right? And so if you keep in this flow, you'll understand how the parameters can be gone from there. So it's going to be as complicated as you want. Parameters can be named, positional switching, and that's what we're going to get to later on today.
Hey, Phil.
So, yeah.
So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Did you see today that the new version of PowerShell was released? And they've added to the begin, process, end block. They've added a clean block.
Oh no, I did not know that.
So that's brand new today. So
right.
Yeah, you can clean up all your stuff. If you need that, you can clean things up.
Oh, so it's like a finally.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
well, I think of it towards the finally, but I'm sure it's got some nuance to it. But yeah, they're calling it a clean block.
So yeah, that's one of the things I'll talk about later is this idea of while you're in the process and begin block, if you throw errors, you never get to end. And so that's probably what clean is going to be about. And that there's been requests for that long term. So probably clean is exactly that function.
Yeah.
So if you were, depending upon how long you've been in PowerShell, you've used something called the ISE, and inside the ISE, you have things called snippets. So, hey, well, you just started here. I'm going to select this really quick. And so I'm going to just write some code, get service. And well, that doesn't really do anything for me. So I want to actually create a function for me. Well, in ISE, they had this control J, and you can build just a simple function. And that's what it actually put this code in for you. And I just want to show that out there, point to you at that point. So you can just say control J. There you go. And then just type function, and then it'll build you a function straight off the point. So you can do some autocomplete in that form. So it doesn't really do anything for you, but it will give you that simple function. Kind of like I talked before, is that the function can be simple. All these parts are not listed here, but they are there. One of the other options inside of the ISE as well is you can get an advanced function. And this is the code that it puts in there for you automatically. So we'll talk about some of these parts later on in the code, but I just want to give you that ability, or that lets you know that it's there. If you're still using the ISE, you can certainly do it there. So, hey, I'll give you a command prompt, command, verb, noun, a bunch of the param blocks, and then process it. And you just fill in the different parts you're looking for. Okay. So there's also a more complete version. They call it complete. So we'll go back to the command prompt. Control J. more advanced function. And so if you're still using the ISE, you can certainly use this. And then when I first started out with this, I would basically do this and then just remove the parts that I don't want. And so in order to get yourself started with functions, it's an easy way to get yourself started. So just wanted to point that out at this point. So we're kind of talking just even that format. So this is to get you started. If you're working with VS Code, there are functions that you can use. Actually, let's do that really quick. Forgot to start this. I think I did it in a test. No, we'll just do a new file. That's 2.ps1. It's 2, right? You can just type functions, and then it will give you a function for you. Okay, and it will give you a function, and you can go through that methodology. So it has autocomplete. If you're using VS Code, there are a couple of really good articles by Shane O'Neill and also our good friend Jeff Hicks, who talk about how to create your own custom versions of it. But in the box, you get this standard custom function definition that will work in PowerShell. Then there's also an advanced version of PowerShell function. So it uses the same verb noun points at that point. So I point out that if you're using VS Code, so what I've discovered at one point was really cool. Get child item, right? So if you select all this stuff, right, and then now I'm just going to function advanced. What didn't do what I was thinking to do. Oh, so there it did what. So if you're using VS Code and you're creating functions and it did this autocomplete, but you notice now it actually is keeping the code, keeping me highlighted here. So I can say get my stuff. And I just hit stuff. And I hit tab and it gives me to the next part, and it will tab you around into the function as you go. But one of the cool things too is it took all the code that I just highlighted and it stuck it in the parts of the function that you needed. So it kind of gets you halfway there, at least you part way there, just by using the advanced function autocompletion within VS Code. So that is also a really easy way to get yourself settled with advanced functions in there, or at least create your own things. So we kind of talked quickly about, all right, so let's have a conversation about function names. In previous languages, functions are whatever the heck you want it to be. But in PowerShell, we want to conform to keep things PowerShell-y. There is this structure of a verb noun. So you want to get something. You want to get, set, push, that. And you can even, there is a list of approved verbs that you want to use. So that list is fairly long. And here's the entire list of all the approved verbs that you could possibly use. So you want to stop something, you want to start something, you want to restart something. But the whole point is, it is that next thing that you're going to do. You're going to build something, this, that. And you'll see that in a bunch of the examples that we're going to talk about later on. I'm going to do get a lot of stuff. I'm going to test a couple stuff just because it's just the easiest thing. And in the PowerShell world, a lot of it is discoverability, and you want to be able to discover things, and you want to be able to find things. And that's one of the powers of PowerShell overall is its discoverability and finding things that you're not necessarily looking for. So, all right. So we kind of talked about when you write a function, your function name should always be verb noun. Okay, you want to keep it in that way. So noun doesn't even need to be singular, can be plural, whatever it needs to be, but get this. And even if you look at commandlets that everybody uses, so it's get AD something, get AD something, get AZ something for Azure, get VM this, get everything, but it's always the noun at that point. So let's talk about creating just a simple function. All right. So functions can be very, very simple. So here's two simple examples of functions. And so I'm just going to say get explorer process. Well, all it's going to do is inside of the function, it's going to do one little command saying get my explorer. Okay. So it's going to get the process explorer. So if I run this, hey, it comes back with, just gives me Explorer. So if you didn't know, just this is the whole notebook thing, is that this is the code, and then this is what is responded back into the console. So I can do this without actually dumping out into the console. So if you weren't aware what that's happening in that function, we're going to do some visualization up here, and then we're going to actually execute a bunch of code, and you'll see it live responding to us at that point. So, hey, that was very simple. Hey, I can wrap other stuff at this point. So I can run one command. I can actually have something do something else. All right, here we go. Same thing. Hey, go get me, this item in this folder, or just give me the single item. This is what I'm looking for. Give me the current item. I'm currently in the New York Posh group folder. Certainly thing. So I create another function, and I could do multiple functions within it. I can actually call my previous functions in this function. So I can do some recursive calls. I can add other functions from somewhere else. This can be full commandlets. This can be anything you want at this point. I'm going to call this get stuff. I'm running get stuff. But at this point, this looks a little bit different than what I just returned up here. I got this and I got this, but because I'm now returning two different object types, it doesn't format properly. So later on, we might get to the idea of trying to play with your output and what you're doing with your output. So that is interesting. Something you have to just consider when you're working with what you're throwing out to the next pipeline. All right. So yeah, think about what you're working up, and then more to come on that topic. So let's go back to what this function block talked about. So here's a function call we saw before. We give it a function name, but now we have some parameters now. So we just ran some code up before that didn't accept anything, just did some work based upon what we ran. But now I actually want to do something. I want to take some input, and I want to process that input that I'm taking from them. So now I want to say, hey, I want the user to supply me with a name, right? So I want to give me name. So, hey, I'm going to get the process. This is my process, but I'm saying get me the process code. Oh, and VS Code is what it is. And so it creates multiple instances of the code itself. It's running threads and kind of stuff. So it's a good example of I'm getting getting the processes of the code itself. So you see at that point, well, so that's an easy way. Again, we're not doing anything funky, anything special. We're simply defining a function. We're taking a parameter, basically a parameter, a variable from the user, and then just working with that value itself. So I want to also point out is that functions can look like multiple things. This is the exact same code. It looks the same, but it's using this structure, and it's not really PowerShell-y, because most PowerShell would look like this, or will look like, or we'll get to it later, will be actually a named parameter. Okay, so there are some people who put it like this. Like, again, it's kind of this battle to say, hey, well, it works. Well, yeah, it does work, but it's tough to look at this code and just immediately know that, hey, this is PowerShell, or it's going to respect all the things that we're going to get later on when we're working with PowerShell. So by doing it this way, you're going to lose some functionality by trying to keep into this structure of this parameters of the inputs themselves. And we'll see what that is later on when we talk about this, right? So one of the things I want to also point out is because we defined that, hey, it's going to take in a property, if we're now calling that function without it, well, then it's going to throw an error. It's going to say, hey, I can't, you told me I'm expecting a name, but you didn't give me anything. It's now empty. You got to give me something. And so, well, when you write your own functions, you should account for that kind of stuff. And so let's talk about using the same functionality, the same format. Well, how to provide default input inside of your the default input for those values. So if nobody gives you a value for what's going to put into name, you're going to put something in there for you. So we're going to run this as well. So the same function that we ran up here before, get my process. We're going to run it again. And oh, I didn't give it a value. So I stuck Explorer into the name. And now I get Explorer instead of whatever I would have given it. But this functionality still works if I simply do code, just like I did above as well. So if I give it a value, it'll use that value. If I don't give it a value, it'll use whatever I have defined for that parameter name. So we're still working in this whole function name or function this function keyword, then the actual get verb noun, then this parameter block only within parameters, and then the actual statements themselves. So this is the almost like the core of what the bare minimum that you need to define in order to create a function. But we're going to actually go beyond that because now we want to actually do some more with it. Okay, so we want to go beyond that parameter names. So we want to use that functionality. So now that we're using $name, we could actually use the same thing. So the same function that we did before, here it is available to you. This is how you should be calling your functions if you're going to call the functions that you're going to use. Okay, you should give it a name. You should use the name, and we do this for discoverability. So just throwing out there without a name, you don't know that there are other properties available to you here at this point. You only have name. You only have a name. So there's nothing else available to you. Okay. So you want to potentially call your functions when you're calling them to actually use the name parameter. Okay. So yep, that's that. All right, so you want to call it this way. We're still going to keep our process definition, but we're going to actually run it this way. So with PowerShell, everything can support the pipeline. So here we are. We're going to take a list of names and we're going to pass it across the pipeline to our get process. But I'm like, wait, this is not exactly what we would have expected. So we took these three values and we were trying to pass it to here. But what we defined for us is just says, give me a name using this name property. I want this over here, not over here. So because we defined it in this form, it won't accept pipeline inputs. It's expecting it on this side. So because we wrote this basic function and it doesn't support that, we'll have to add some functionality to it to give us that functionality. So core functionality, very simple parameters, very simple stuff. You get a very simple function. It doesn't do a lot for you, but we want to take this better. We want to expand this out and go beyond. So we want your functions to work the PowerShell way. We want the pipeline input, the other functionality. So this is where we're going to get into the meat of the thing. We're going to get into the meat of the process. We're going to start with here I come back to this standard function that we kind of talked about. This is the form. We talked about function, the keyword, the name. We talked about these parameters. But if you're aware of how these structures are defined, because it's in square braces here, that means it's optional. So we don't have to have this parameter here. We can set all the parameters down here, and it's called the param block. Now, because the param block is so extensive, we're going to skip over it for now, and I want to talk about dynamic params. We're going to jump down all the way down to the param block, and we're going to go up to there at the end because there's a lot of magic happening in the param block. So we're going to talk about param blocks, the dynamic param blocks. So the dynamic parameters that are available to you, 90% of the people don't use them, but for completeness, I certainly wanted to cover them in this talk. Okay, so you can certainly look at Microsoft Docs, and there is an entire help document that talks about it. So a lot of the stuff you can go find there, but can be difficult for usability and it's difficult to create. So not used, but again, because I want to do for completion, we do want to give you the ability to do it. So I'm actually going to run this really quick. So it's going to define it, but let's look at what's happening here. So they created a param block, and if the path variable, which is here, actually starts with this, it's going to start doing some funky stuff. Well, what the heck's it doing? And so I'm going to actually just watch down in here. I'm going to actually explain kind of what's happening here. So if I'm in here we go. If I'm here, I now have this key count parameter. It's available. It doesn't exist anyway. So that's what's going to happen. So if it starts with here, it's going to go through and do some work. It's then going to create its own parameter, a new parameter called key count, and add it there. So now you can see I have this key count. It goes here, and there's this new parameter that is going to be defined. But if I just simply do $, support, right, and I go look at all the parameters available, key count doesn't exist anymore. So that's why people don't use it very often, because it really cramps your style with discoverability. But key count only exists if the path variable happens to be there. Again, this can be as complex, as simple as you want, but it's also, this is, I don't know, here, I'll come back. How many lines of code is this? This is 15 lines of code just to give me the ability to add a dynamic parameter only if certain things, if you might want one, but typically people don't use it in this fashion. So, and you can also work on argument completers if you want to kind of get to that functionality. But again, this is just for completeness. There is something called the dynamic param block. It's really tough to work on. There is documentation on how to create one. Don't really use it. All right, let's move on to the next section. Again, coming back to this PowerShell format. So we talked about dynamic parameters. Let's talk about begin, process, and end. This is the work. 99% of your work is all going to be here in begin, process, and end. This is a rough overview of what is happening when your code is getting called. Every single time you function is get called, it is attempting to run a begin, it will run a process, and it will attempt to end. Okay, but begin only gets called first, only called once. So if you have nothing in the pipeline, begin still gets called, process still gets called, and end gets called. 1, 2, 3, boom, boom, boom. Right? If you're accepting pipeline input, then begin gets called at the very beginning before any pipeline input is defined. Then process is called for every single item in the pipeline. So if you have that example that I gave before, I had 3 names and then I passed it to my process. Well, I would get process would be called 3 times, and then end would be called once. So I get once, 3, 1, 2, 3, and I get the end at the end. So some people may ask, well, what's the point of that? Well, begin can be used for setup. Hey, I want to make sure that I've initialized some variables. I want to connected to something. I want to set up some variables. I want to do some counting. I could count the items in the pipeline. I can do some of that. Then I can go and process the items in the pipeline. Then I can clean up after myself. So that's what it's used for. And let's show some examples at this point. So there's an example, and here I'm going to write this roughly the exact same function, and we're going to call it. So what is going to happen is we're simply going to say, hey, we're calling the for begin. So this is writing the host using yellow. We're going to say this is begin block. In the process block, we're going to call the green, and then cyan is going to be the end block. So we're going to call this process function, and we're going to watch it go and go. So we're going to watch it the first time. So we see it called begin, process. I wrote out what variables happen to be then because I'm playing with this param block, and there's the end. So you see that I don't call anything. There's no pipeline. There's nothing at the end. I get 1, 2, 3, boom, in that order. So if I call with something, well, it looks pretty much the same, but now I've defined the variable. And so this param that I had defined is now been here. So I can see that I took some input in. All right, so what happens if I actually pass it in as the pipeline? Well, here we see, again, we're calling the begin block. We're in the process block, and then here we go. We have the first item. Process block gets called again. We get the second item. Process block called the third time, and we get the third item. And then we get the end block. So when you're working with the pipeline input, you got to know that you do your prep work, everything that's happened in your process, you can do your other stuff. And let's update the parameter so that it accepts pipeline input. Oh, in this example here. So I actually worked with this other example is I was actually using the current item in the list as opposed to actually using the parameter. So that actually got put into a special variable. I forgot to mention that at this point. So yeah, so in my first version, the $_ is the current item in the list, right? Is the current item in the pipeline, right? So that is a special variable. You can probably see it in a bunch of other places when you're using where blocks or anything else like that. $_ PS item is always available in the when you're using pipeline input. $item, PS item, and $_. Same thing. It's actually kind of defined there at this point. Okay, so when that went through the list, now I'm changing this parameter. So this is where if I had defined the parameter at the top, I wouldn't be able to change the properties of the parameter itself. So now I'm saying param value can take pipeline input. So now if I run this, we see that the param value is what was in the pipeline. So now I can assume what's in the pipeline, but also I can assign it to variables. And so that's what that's doing. I'm taking whatever was in the pipeline and I'm sticking it in that variable. So now I can now work with it. Okay, so if you're in here, $_ is the current item in the process, or I can actually assign it to a value, and that's what I put here. There you go. Any questions? Hopefully I'm not confusing anybody at this point. All right, so we'll run this whole thing again, but I'm gonna actually switch the array and I'm gonna stick it on the other side. So you notice what you get exactly what we kind of talked about. We're no longer working with the pipeline. The entire function gets called once. You get a begin, you get a process, but what's inside param value? So all of that default parameter got put here. All three items got put in here as one part. Well, that's really not what we really want either. We wanted to actually see three of these things. So let's go look at that same function we talked about before, but we're going to add some other stuff. First time we added the pipeline input, but now I'm going to say, I'm going to change this default up here. It was an array before, but I think I added it. So I'm now going to say this can take a string of arrays, an array of strings. So param value can take an array of strings. And then inside my process block, I'm going to say, hey, if param, okay, is an array, then I'm going to take the first one out and I'm going to run through a for each loop. If I'm going to take the second one, run through a for each loop. And so I'm changing the function slightly because now I want to deal with the value in there. And so this is an example of how you can then use this same function. This process function works this way. Oh, I didn't run this one. There we go. Now I run it. Boop. Now I get three items through the process block. Actually, you know what? I should do this. I'm going to take this out. I'm going to throw this on the outside. I'm talking. I'm like, oh, this might be a better explanation of how it's working. So if we run it now, this, we get one process block and there's the three items, boom, 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 boom in that list. That's probably a better explanation. And hopefully you can see that. Again, we only got through one process block because process gets called for every item in the pipeline, and it's at least once. So there we go at that point. So here's an example. And if you want this code later on, you know, it'll certainly be posted up into YouTube. And hopefully, all right. So any other questions? Nope, no questions at this point. Here we are back to our friend. This is our friend. We're looking back at this standard format. We talked about the dynamic parameter blocks. We talked about begin, process, and end. I think that, again, reiterating with begin, process, and end is understanding when begin gets called, when end gets called, and how often process gets called. It's all based, they will always be there. You can, you know, we saw in our simple example before, 90% of the time, people just drop them in here. You can delete them, you can leave them here, but it's just empty code. I typically leave them in my code, primarily to give me a reminder that it's there and it will be called, even if nothing's there. So it's always there. So we're going to come back up into command line binding. So with command line binding, we can take our function and actually make it look like an actual compiled commandlet. Excuse me. So what does that mean for us? So what that means is that we get a bunch of features for free. Okay, we can get, I I keep double clicking. So we get some other parameters for free. Okay, we get verbose, we get debug. We can, I don't know, we get verbose. It's not so much that you get verbose. You now have the option, you now have the ability to actually use verbose input, output, everything else. You can now use the verbose debug, what if commits, and other items that make your function on steroids effectively. So you can now allow your function to actually produce verbose output. You can add verbose stuff. You can add the right verbose commands to your functions, and then they will give verbose output. So if you don't basically add the single line to your function, then it just won't do that. So we'll kind of do at this point. So in this example up here, it's just commandlet binding that just turns it on, but you can also turn on individual pieces of it. So all the options available to you in commandlet binding is confirm impact, parameter sets, help URI, support paging, and other stuff. You can look at the documentation to find out what each one of these is. We're going to actually talk about some examples at this point, but go from there. So we're going to do a simple example at this point, but we're going to add commandlet binding. It doesn't really going to do much. All it's going to do is it's going to take a current path, current item, going to give me all the items in the current path, and then it's going to just output the file, right? All right. But we're going to have this verbose thing, right? Because we added commandlet binding, we now have the ability to, hey, here's all the items in the current folder. Woohoo, that's fine. But that's all we get? No, but now, because we added commandlet binding to this, we can now, this didn't do anything. Now we can pass the verbose output to our function, and now it now respects verbose. Actually, just as an example, we're going to drop this from there. We're going to run this. All right, function, hey, it's good. It'll take it. All this is still good. Didn't do anything. Didn't do anything. Nothing happened. We can't use verbose. We can't use any of the other items that give us this other output. You can, one of the things that by adding commandlet binding, you have these error actions, error variables. This doesn't do anything. You have to, it gives you the ability to work with it. So if you know what error action does, is you can then set your functions to stop. Here's a non-terminating error. That's kind of inside baseball. But what you do when errors happen, it then enables you to use the error variable. So if you're using an error variable, that's what error variable is all about. And all these, we don't need to go down to the deep because we're going to try and go as high as we can, and then we're going to go down deeper later. So here we go. We redefined that function. Oh, I didn't rerun it. So now with commandlet binding, we now have this. I can now use write verbose, write verbog. All of these other things that use those other commandlets are now supported. So with commandlet binding, we also have this option of should process. So this is also a thing that you eventually should really start using more effectively. And then what does should process give you? Well, that's what this what if does. So it says, hey, if I was to do this work, I'm now going to delete this sample file. So it's going to here go give me all the text files in this folder. And it says, I'm telling myself, that's this word delete, that it's going to delete the file. Oh, crap. So if this is something that, hey, should it be doing work? No, I want to tell it it's going to do some work, but I want to actually support the actual what if. So if I actually did it, and you see over here, boop, I just lost my sample file. There's nothing really in it. Brought it back. But if I actually run this all day long, it says, hey, this is what you're going to do. But if you don't run it, you can then, by simply adding commandlet binding should process, and then this line of code, you can then allow yourself very simply to protect you, not protect you, I'm going to come back to the idea that the reason I enjoy PowerShell so much is the flexibility to make it do what I want with not so much work at this point. I don't have to build all the scaffolding. I just add a couple lines here, a couple lines there, and now I get for free all of this other scaffolding that I can then add some work to me. Well, now I want to do the reverse. Hey, now I want to say, if something happens, I want to do it. No, I want to say, you have to actually confirm that it's going to happen. So now we have this confirm height, confirm impact. So it says, hey, what you're going to do is very aggressive. Now you have to actually say, yeah, I definitely want to do it. So this is the reverse of that. Instead of, I'm going to do something really bad and tell me what's going to happen before I do it. Now I'm going to say, I'm not going to do it unless you confirm it. So we're going to add confirm. It's the same thing should, but the same code here, but now I'm going to say, I'm going to confirm it. So now roughly the same function with a confirm, it says, do you really want to do this? And I have to say it up here. I'm going to actually say no up at the top and say, nope, nothing happened. I didn't lose anything. Let's just run this again. Do you really want to do this? Yes, I want to run it. And our sample went away. Uh-oh, now we got to bring it back. Let's bring this back. All right. So without actually doing it, we actually have to say, so, and if you want to run it without, so what it does is actually it implies this number. So that's what happens. So there are some commandlets where you see that this just turns it on by default. That's why I set by. So this says, or we can say, confirm, don't prompt me. So that's really what this is saying here at this point. So it's saying, hey, that confirm that you keep asking me for, no, set it to false because I don't really care, right? So that's the way to override the don't prompt me, kind of like it's the quiet mode of this commandlet. So we're now saying, hey, it needs to be confirmed. Well, I'm going to say, don't ask me. So confirm equals false. All right. Hopefully, nobody, haven't lost anybody just yet. All right. And here we are back to our local friend PowerShell format. So we're here. We talked about dynamic parameters. We've referenced through, oh, I dropped the commandlet binding from this one, but it's already there because we just talked about it. But now we have this new thing, param block. So this is, as I say, this is where the magic happens. This is where you get the most bang for your buck when you make any changes to your functions or to anything when you're adding. Okay, you get validation, you get assignments, you also get auto completion if you can, and ultimately it's discoverability. So this is, you look at this going like, holy moly, what is happening here? So right here is the name of the parameter. We saw all that before. It's just in this little, parentheses, name equals explorer. That was that fun thing before. Well, now this allows us to add all this other logic all to this single parameter. We can set a bunch of values. We can make all these options just for this one value. And it gives us a bunch of logic and a bunch of code that for free that will allow us to do a bunch of stuff. Okay. And so that's where this param is all about. So that's why I want to kind of get into some deep dives. When you're writing your function, all of that, the above is here. So your name function is up there. All this down here is your begin, your process, your end. All of that's down here. So this is, we're only going to be looking inside this param block. So this is an example of what can be. And then here we are citing the second one. So we have one parameter, and then we define another one. We just separated by a single comma. So we separate them by commas. Yeah, I think we'll go from there. All right. So let's talk about mandatory parameters, right? So we're going to say this get my service. So we have a function, the name. We're going to say this parameter name is mandatory. You can set it using equals true, or this is the same thing. If you simply just name the argument, an argument to the parameter, it just assumes it's true. So it's the PowerShell way. If it's been defined, it's true. If it's not been defined, then it's false. So, and then what are we doing inside of it? We're simply getting the service where we're just running some code. So getting the service of whatever that name is, where its status is whatever that is. So, excuse me, we're going to run this. It says, hey, get service, pipeline input, supply the values for the finding. Well, it says, you got to give me a status. So it's sitting here waiting to say, give me the status. Tell me what status you need to be was giving me there. So I'm going to say running. Hey, we have the running status. And we'll run this again and we'll say stopped. And we get nothing back because this workstation is not stopped. But it can also be, hey, we're just going to run this. We're going to say apple bottle. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't do anything because all it did was took whatever you gave it and it's fit here. All right. But it said, you got to give me something. So just like we kind of, if you didn't define it here, then you have to define it. So we're going to run this again and it looks just like before. So we ran it. It prompted you for that input because it is mandatory. And then it prompts you there. So it has to put it there. So just by putting this one line here, you can guarantee that you're going to get input from somewhere. It's got to come from somewhere. Okay. Let's talk about position. So we can do the same thing. In this example, we're going to say, hey, it's one at the zero position, excuse me. So this is going to be a zero array. So the first position is the 0, second, and and so on. So you can say that this, whatever's in the 0 position is going to be put into name. Whatever is in the 1 position is going to be put in status. So if we run this one, we'll run this one first. So this is going to be the name, and this is going to be the status. But that also means I should swap these two. But this doesn't mean that if you actually use the name. So if you use the named parameter, so I'm like to say, hey, the status, well, that's going to go first, but still works. But if you don't name them, it's going to use the position. So I can walk through and I can go through a bunch of stuff and say, hey, I want this to be at this position, at that position, and I don't actually have to name them themselves. So that's where it's at that point. Hopefully we're still following people. All right. We're going to keep on and adding some more functions, more stuff to this function. This is really the exact same thing. We just keep adding and adding stuff to them, right? So we're going to run the same thing now, but this is the new version that, again, going to be mandatory. It's at the 0 position. And if you don't get a value, we're going to say, hey, so named overrides position. So if you name it, it automatically uses it. So yeah, position is only used if it hasn't been named. So yeah, position is used only if it hasn't been named. So if the PowerShell engine has to guess what parameter it should be, it will use position. But if it doesn't know, then, or if it knows, it's going to put it where it needs to be. Actually, I don't know what would happen if you used 0 and then you named only status. Let's try that. That's a good point. Let's see at this point. I guess it moves, but what if I do a third? I don't know, 0. What if I put 1 and 1? I don't know. That's something you can test. So the code is going to be here, and you can simply, so that's going to be named. So here we are. And if you don't give it a value, and you actually have to give it something, but I'm also going to say it comes from the pipeline. And again, I'm using this structure as to, it has the argument, but it can be true. And we're also going to add this thing called validate set. It's not really defined up here, but we're going to see it later too. All right. So I'm going to say get my service. Well, but because I gave this help, it says, hey, if you want some help, just type that. All right. So, and then it says, oh, enter the service name. Oh, the service name, LAN manager. Or LAN man. Oh, that's not the right one. What is it? That's not LAN man. It's you know what? I'll just do wrong bits. So do that. You can actually talk to the user. Hey, this is what you want. Oh, that's what I want. All right. So I want the bit service. I know that one's going to be there. And bits isn't running. Clear output. Let me say workstation. There we go. I know that one's right. LAN man workstation. That's what it's called. All right. So that is also an option, right? And oh, there you go. There's the validate set. I knew I put it there somewhere. Validate set. So validate set. what does validate set do? Means that we're going to run bits and it can be stopped. But with validate set, we're going to do here at this point, I'm going to do, so if you don't know what I'm doing here, I'm using control space, which gives you tab completion and PS line. So these means that, hey, you can use any one of these. So if I do this and I do that, that's the only option that is available to me, because it will guarantee that these are the options available to you. They call it JSON or just some other status, but it can be anything you want at this point. You can say open. I'm going to run this again. And so now I can now allow my user to say, here's what it is, and it allows you to tab complete and validate that you're going to put something there. If I call it that, and I'm running this, it says, boop, the status can't be that value. It's giving you this value, and it tells you, hey, it needs to be one of these. So for free, simply by putting validate set, you now have this error check that says, hey, I only want certain inputs to be valid for me. So you can do some preventative maintenance for your functions that says, hey, only allow certain things to happen. Okay, and that's what is part of that magic. And say, hey, I don't want to do any of this code unless I can guarantee that this is here. So you kind of saw down here, we also said this comes from pipeline input. So that's, I'm looking really quickly here. So I'm going to take pipeline input. I'm not going to give it a status name because it can't come from the pipeline, but it's also going to use the same structure that we talked about before, is that we're going to set its status automatically running only if it's running. And we're going to run this. Oh, looks like, oh yeah, bits is not running. That's why it's not running. So bits is not running. Oh, it stopped. That's why. So I'm only looking for, and then I can do status. Status, and we're going to say stopped. I'm going to run this again, and when we get one of them, because I know that's the only one not stopped. So of those, that's how, so the services that you run before, all of this other stuff, this is actually how it's working. These are compiled commandlets. So these are compiled code, and they are getting this functionality of all of this other stuff for us because it's doing all this other work. It's doing that other stuff. So we are making our functions look just like a full-fledged function. So we can do that tab completion in that fashion. Oh yeah, and here's the completion to validate set. You haven't defined the status. Okay, so I said a status, but I didn't define it. So it says you have to give a value because it's missing the argument. We said this is a mandatory value. It has to have something. So it's got to have something. Let's say the running ones and go from there. And this section, we're going to say, and so much more. So again, you can use get help if you, and actually let's do this. I'm going to actually come back. We're going to launch some code. Quit. Oh, did I copy paste that? So using that same functionality, we can say get advanced functions. This is all that you can use. You can simply go to the Microsoft Docs. Talked about before. Yeah, I showed that before. Gives you all the extra commandlets that are properties are available, but I want to review some of the things that you get automatically. So much more. We're calling this so much more. I'm actually going to run this because it's really tough to try and work through that. So I just want to describe what you can get from there. So I have this file name parameter, right? Kind of talked about before. We're setting its default value to star.txt. That's how you can set the default value. What its type is, well, it's an array of strings, but we also have this thing validate count. Well, what is that? That means that in this array, there has to be at least 1 to 5 of them. If you give the array happens to have 0 in it, it's empty. Nope, error. We get that error we showed before. There's 6 of them in there, boom, error out. So you can guarantee that what comes in here is exactly what you want. All right. You can also say, I don't want the parameter to be file name. I want it to be path. You can simply say what comes in. I want to use whatever was in the path. The object coming in is from path. So you can use alternate property names and have it automatically map. So if you had an object that has a path property, it automatically gets populated into this file name property, and you can use it at that point. So you can do, alias 1, 2, like a whole bunch of aliases. That's what aliases gives us. Again, we're just validating parameters at the very beginning. Value by property name, we kind of talked about, well, we didn't talk about it, but we get a value by property name. So the value from the pipeline comes in, but whatever is in that property name gets put into this value. That's what that means. I'm going to get to the parameter set in a little bit. Let's look at range. Hey, so if I'm working with a number, I can say that it has to be between 0 and 1, 0 and 10, not 0 and 1. So you can match basically a range. You could even stick inside of this range, just say positive, negative, non-negative, non-positive, which includes 0 if it's non-negative and that kind of thing. So has to be a positive, has to be a negative number. So you have the ability to say, hey, when you give me a number, only give me a positive number or only give me a negative number. So you can effectively tell your command or your function that I only want these certain types of numbers. So with one little line of code, you can say, hey, I want to count, but what happens if somebody gives you a negative number? All right. Or within a range, well, I only want something under 10,000. Boom. You could also pattern match. So you can take a string and then just a full-on regular expression. Say, hey, you make, regex is your friend. There you go. I have to have 4 numbers in sequence. It has to be 4 numbers. Let's go. What else we got? Validate script can be used as well. So validate script is a fun one because whatever is coming into this parameter, it's going to validate that it has to be true. Okay. So matches if not false. So if this doesn't return false, then you're good to go, right? So that's kind of the funky one, but you can write any PowerShell script you want inside of this validate script to validate that this is. And I think in my examples, you'll see later on, is that I'm doing some stuff with date matching, you'll see that. So later on, you'll see that. Validate not null, validates that the string is not null and not empty. So you can say, give me something, but can't be null. And then you could also say, hey, give me a string and validate that how long it is. So give me a string, but it has to be at least, less than 10 characters long. So, hey, give me a password, but it has to be 6 characters long, right? You can say it has to be between this length. And by adding the simple line, the error will actually tell you, hey, this length has to be between this date and there. Yeah, at that point. Hopefully, this was really difficult to try and explain and give examples of each one, so I just dumped it out here and so much more. And hopefully you can come up with this, and you'll see some of my examples as to more in practical application. But that is a good example at that point. Let's talk about parameter types. Oh, parameter types. There it is. Standard types. So I kind of gleaned over or glossed over the parameter type point. So we give it a parameter name, but then we say what type this parameter is. You don't actually have to define a type because inside of PowerShell, everything is an object and everything goes all the way up to the object type. But you can say, hey, this has to be a string or this has to be an integer so that you can actually guarantee that kind of stuff and you can that point. So I'm going to say, go get my files, get my files from the pipeline is true. It's defaulting to that and it's defaulting to 1. So go get me everything here and goes into the first item in the list. If I actually pass in a string, well, then it's automatically put inside of this name property because it's coming from the pipeline. It's coming from the pipeline and it's doing a string. It goes there automatically. So it implies it takes whatever this is and stick it in here, doesn't stick it here, right? So in the same fashion, hey, I'm going to say 4 of them. I'm going to use the word for. No, it doesn't like it because it actually wants the number 4. So if I say 4, all right, where we get the 4 items, right? So I can't actually use a word. So it will do some type comparisons for me. So if you give it the wrong type, if it can't, I'm going to say give it the wrong type. If it's a string, numbers can become strings. So if PowerShell, if basically the .NET stack can't convert this to that type, it'll throw an error. But again, this string can't become a number. There's no way to take this and make it a system in 32. Hey, input string has to be at least this format. That's what it says at this point. So I'm going to do the reverse. So actually here, we'll run the same thing. And then we see that, hey, I can give it a number because again, I'm switching it. This has to be an input and it coming from here. So if I give it a number, I get 3 items. If I give it the word, same thing in reverse. So it's that reverse thing, right? So when you're defining your parameters, it's always a good idea to actually give it a, so that you can play with that. Know that if you give it just the type name, then you could also give it an array of that same type, and lets you know that you can give it an array. Let's work on switches. Switches is a unique type. It's not actually a .NET type of a value. It is actually almost like a Boolean. It's like a Boolean, but it's not a Boolean. All right. So we're going to run this whole thing at this point. So what this does is it gives you this name property that has no value at the end. You don't actually give it like, $true. You don't give it a value. It is effectively a switch. It's either on or off. So if you name it, then it is on, right? So quickly, just so you understand what this just did, it says, hey, I only want the name of the process. So if you want, give me just the name of the process. Otherwise, just give me the whole object. And so don't actually say name only. Well, then it gives me the whole object. Otherwise, I only want the name, then I'm throwing this switch. I'm saying that if I want this variable to be true, I need to set it. Otherwise, it becomes off. So again, it converts, it is a true false, but it assumes everything is off by default until you set it on. So effectively, a good example of this is recurse. So everybody knows that right now is that get child item. You can do that, but then if you turn on this switch, it will then go down the directory tree. And this is, you get that, this is how that work is happening. There's a property called of type switch. And once it says recursive, then it goes down the pipeline. And so there is an if in that code somewhere that says, do you go down the tree? Okay, will only recurse if it's been set to on. I bring up the point of switching because there is, you can use bool, and people have saying, oh, well, I just use bool instead. Well, you should not use bool at this point. For that functionality, you should not use bool. So this is the exact same code, nothing more than the exact same code. But you can see, hey, it's the exact same code, but the only way to get that name only, so name only, but it's a Boolean. It actually has to be defined. Okay, it has to be defined. So you have to say $true. You have to define it in its prior. It has to be defined true or false, whatever. So you could say false. Let me come back. Say false. So it doesn't give you that functionality. It's not a switch. It's a Boolean, and it has to respect. You have to give it a value type. You can't just assume it. All right. So we played this whole game of working with these parameters. We're going down the line. We're adding parameters. We're sticking in the front. We're sticking in the end. Well, when you get to really complicated functions with a lot of parameters, it could be in your best interest to take all those parameters and stick them into a hash table just for readability sake, so it doesn't scroll off the screen. Probably should have come up with an example here, but what you can define all the properties into a hash table. And then we're using the same thing we did up here, that same switch. And we can then define a variable, a hash table. And if you don't know what a hash table is, it's at symbol with the curly brace, but then it's a name value pair. So table is a name value pair of properties, right? And so this variable is the hash table. You can use the at, then that variable name, and it's called a splat. So in the same fashion, here's the switch again, but I'm going to turn the name value into true. So that exact same functionality that we got before, here it is again, without any parameters, without all this kind of thing. So I typically like to keep it and call the variable called param hash or whatever kind of thing, call it hash, so that when you come down here, you know that it's a hash table. I don't know if any questions there. Nope. And same thing can be used in, there's the exact same thing in help. All right, let's talk about the help. All right, function-based help. Comment-based help helps us all. Same kind of thing with functions. When you're dealing with your code itself, it is always a good idea to, or not even always a good idea, it always helps to write a good help. Help is defined as a simple, looks like almost like a JavaScript, like HTML comment block, but that's effectively what it is. This is comment-based help. So when you're writing your function, and we're going to see some examples later, you write a synopsis, description, and then you define all the parameters. So it's really short description, long description. You should be defining every single one of your parameters. Give some examples of how the function is working. I don't typically do inputs and outputs, but I'm putting it here for brevity. And then I always add notes. And then if you wanted to do a link back to your function. So when you're writing your help, it's always a good idea to actually put in a help, so that when you get all these other helps, when you say get help or get service, you get all this functionality, right? So actually, you know what? We'll show some examples later. So help, write your help. And we kind of talked about some output. If we define our functions, know that whatever you're sticking out comes out, right? Goes to the pipeline, goes to the standard out, goes to actually out default. Now, out default is what happens at the end of the pipeline. So out default comes to here, and it's actually not going to anywhere because this doesn't output. But the same functionality. So we defined our simple function. I didn't need to make a crazy one. It's going to go to output, export CSV, but even simple functions can operate just like commandlets themselves. So that's what I wanted to demonstrate at this point. So instead of getting stuff to the console, I threw it into a CSV, and now here's the CSV in Excel. When you're dealing with these outputs that you're working with, I wanted to point out the idea of returning things. So if you see code from VBScript, from Python, a bunch of stuff, people who work with that, they like to return things because that is the return statement exists in their environment. And so, hey, it has to be returned. But with return, you need to be careful when using it in PowerShell because it can have unexpected. You just need to understand what it's doing. What the return is doing, the keyword return, is actually breaking out of the function you're at. So it's returning from where you are. So if you're going through a loop, right, that's what we're going to show here in a second. If you're going through a loop, it's actually going to break. So not going to break, but it's going to jump out. And so I'm going to kind of walk through what this is doing really quickly. So this function says basically, I was like, if it's even, I stole some code and I modified it. So it was going to come from this point. So take in a number, output the current number. If the number is divisible by 2, well, then it's not even, right? If it's not divisible by 2, then basically come out and say this is the return. So I'm going to return, I'm going to jump out. Oops, sorry. I'm going to jump out if it's there, right? And so otherwise, I'm going to come here and only return if not returned. So number 1 is not even, boom, we're out. Number 2 is even, So we don't come inside of here and we get to this time, we get to here. So the number is 2. So if you're doing some code and you're returning, if you're doing kind of like continue, but it's still a little bit different. I don't know if continue works exactly the same way. That's the question in the chat. But return will never get you here. So where I've seen it in complicated stuff, people wanted to return, but they were expecting that code further down inside their function was actually going to run. But once you call a return, it jumps out of the function, right? And it breaks that flow. Not really breaks the flow, but it breaks out of that flow. So it won't ever get to here. It only gets here after, right? So that's what we're trying to say at this point. So it jumps out and never keeps going. So if you wanted to so actually let me try and say it this way. So if we did this and we say out file, right? So this is what we're getting. We are returning, we are getting output, we are getting output, and we are getting output. So if you're only wanting to return this number, then that's you're expecting, but you actually returned and you returned this. If you came through here, you returned this and you return this. So you're getting other stuff. These are getting past the pipeline. They're not, yeah, I'm not sure I'm making that clear. It was better in my head when I practiced this before, but no, just there is a document about return. So better examples about return. But if you're working with outputs, if you ever want to use return, know what it's all about. 90% of me, or I've never used return itself, right? So I just don't use return because it just doesn't help me. All right. Canonical best practice, what return? Yeah. All right. So I have actually reached the bottom of this deep dive. Now, the best example of, I was trying to go through some good stuff, but I thought, you know what? I'm just going to jump through some examples of actual live code, the real function that I've defined. And then you kind of look through, oh, okay, now that I've gone through this deep dive, I can now look at somebody's code and understand what it's doing. So here it is. This is called get my terminal services info. This is what it's doing. Hey, gets the home path and the terminal services path for an AD object. So inside of AD, it says, hey, you can get their home drive, your home directory, but then it also goes inside and gets your terminal services home directories, right? That's in that subset. So this is the help section for it. We can see, oh, we enabled PowerShell commandlet binding. We accept input from the pipeline. You can see. So here it is showing me that I can get an AD user and I can pass it directly to get my TS info because I'm using pipeline input and I'm actually using 2 aliases. So because I'm taking stuff from AD, I want to take whatever that distinguished name was and I want to stick it right into username. If it has a SAM account name, I want to stick it right into username. That's what I'm getting for this. So I can say, give me the real username, give me parts of the username, give me other things, and I get automatically into there. You notice I'm skipping over the begin because I don't need it. I did this whole for each thing. So if I get an array of usernames, well, I want to run through this loop for each one. Otherwise, just if there's only one, well, there's only one. And then it comes through. It does get AD user, does a bunch of stuff, and then it just dumps it back out. So here's some examples of that kind of stuff. So using the knowledge that we've described, you can kind of better see what's happening here, right? Let's look at another example. Again, we're using our help. Hey, this is what it does. It, LAN desk, this kind of thing. Otherwise, basically, if you're remote controlling into a LAN desk machine, it says, hey, you have to prompt the user. Well, I don't really want to prompt the user because, I'm an admin. I want to get myself in there, that kind of thing. So I can give it a computer name in the same form, or I can say, give me a list of computer names and just pass it in, right? So I'm defining all this stuff in. We did this game with computer name. You can give me an array. I'm saying the property is mandatory. It is at position 0. Hey, look, I'm playing this this version thing. I mean, the begin, I'm not working with version. So I'm forcing all commandlets later on to be verbose. So as I'm working in other stuff, I want this code to actually automatically be verbose for me. So that's what I'm doing here. And actually I'm holding on to whatever it was so I don't break it back out. So then it comes, here it is, we're testing connection. I'm gonna get some verbose output. I'm gonna then mess with the local registry on those remote machines. And we're then gonna come back in and I'm gonna reset the verbose preference back in the end, right? So I'm gonna do some prelim work in the begin. I'm gonna do some post work at the end. And I'm gonna do this functionality for each item we pass in. There's that example. I think this is the exact same thing, just in reverse. Yep, I did bring this. This is the enable. This is the enable of the reverse of the disable. Here's, oh, this one doesn't have help. Here's a good example. We're using, this is how I used to do it back in the day. I always set mandatory and then I just chose whether it's false or true, but this is just an old function. Yep, here's a good example too. Again, we're using begin and we're doing some prelim work. So what this is going to do, it says get my hung print queues. So again, I'm a Citrix engineer, worked, and what it's going to do is go get me all the servers, get the site, get all the servers in the site that are online, and stick it into a variable. So as I begin this entire code, I want to go get me a list of all the actual servers that are online. That's good enough, right? And so then I'm going to go through this. Hey, as the computer names I'm passing in, hey, for each one where the computer name, so give me all the servers and figure out which one I'm working on. Then I do some work and then I play this game of parallel. Actually, I created a switch called parallel. So do I want to do this work in parallel? Actually, it looks like I'm creating a script block and I'm invoking a script block upon these machines in parallel, but only if I set it parallel. So if I turn a switch on called parallel and also do action, it's kind of like that too. And I also have pass-through. Here's another one that you typically see with other things. So there's a switch for pass-through. So it does some work. And if I then set pass-through, then it actually spits it back out. Otherwise, it just does some work and doesn't do anything for you. It writes the host, but it actually doesn't return any objects. So there's that example at that point. So I'm hoping that, again, here's our end at the end, and we did some pre-work. So I'm hoping that now that you see that you've done some other stuff, let's look at local. Oops. Here's a longer version of help. I'm going to do some, define all my parameters. Here's an example of what that parameter does. And even, hey, look, I stole this code from this person. Granted, this is the PowerShell way, and we always share, and if we give credit to somebody else, that was the original version, and then I updated it back in 2015. So what it's doing is basically getting the local groups of some random server. So again, I have a computer name variable, and I'm setting its default value to the current computer's variable, computer name, if it's the current. Otherwise, I can accept an object that has these types in there. There is a, so then it's getting the administrator's local group. So then it will go and reach out to the computer itself and get me the local group name members. So go get me the administrator group, or this commandlet could also say, get me the, the local group. I can get the remote desktop users group, where I can go just so long as I pass in that variable. I think I specified that at this point. Get group, and I can get the group name. It's not there, but that's exactly what I can do. So I have a single string. I can give an array of commandlets. No begin, no end, and all the work. So showing this example of here's all this work that I can do, and effectively all I need to do is call the single function. Get X users. Yeah, we're doing the same thing. Not doing anything too crazy. We're validating that things are not null. Oh, here's a good example. So here's where I use, that's why I want to bring this one in. So I wanted to, when we Here's where prepping. We're importing a module. We're importing a PS snap-in for Citrix. If at the very beginning, if it's not done, then we actually throw an error and say, hey, you got to load the snap-in. Otherwise, and when we call a break, it means stop, full on stop. Set a default value of 256 max record count. We only get 256 items, or we say, give me more. Then here's our process and end. But here's an example of where you can use the range that says, hey, I want this to be at least 250, or you can say you can be less or more from that value. So you can reset it to something else, but it doesn't have to be. And you can set default values. And I think the last one here is that, again, really deep and long. Oh, yeah, here was the last one I want to put this guy in. So here's an example of actually using validate script. So I want the number of minutes. So what this is doing is it's setting the SolarWinds maintenance mode for a particular server. So I give him these servers, and then so it's going to set the maintenance window to 4 hours, and I'm going to set it to unmanaged, or I can manage it or unmanage it. So putting servers in maintenance mode for a certain amount of time. All right. So you got to give it a computer name. And then here's the example of parameter sets. So it automatically defaults to minutes. So it will not use the hours parameter, okay, unless I use it. So it will if I run this, it wants to use minutes. These are the valid parameters. But if I change it to hours, it then means minutes doesn't exist. But if hours does. And then end time, if you set an end time, well, then you don't care about the hours and minutes. You want an end date. So this is how we can then say certain parameters exist and will get default values, but only if you don't define other parameters. So it's kind of like that dynamic thing, but you can set that these parameters only exist. So like computer name doesn't have a parameter set. So that means it's in everybody's parameter set. But minutes has a parameter set, hours has a parameter set, end time has a parameter set. And then start time doesn't, because when is start time going to happen? I do some script to validate that the input time matches a thing. Otherwise, it says, please input the time in this format. And so, hey, here's an example of the format. And I'm writing out this into the console to say, hey, if you don't give me a valid time, you have to use it at that point. So I validate that it's working. And if it is, then, hey, it's true. Otherwise, I throw an invalid error. Throw, and then it will say that this parameter can't be defined. And will vary at stop before anything happens. So it will do that validation beforehand. Hopefully everybody's following that. Here's a very long begin, because what we're doing here is, this is a good example. Hey, we're importing the module if we need it. Then I'm creating date. We're doing a bunch of stuff. We're then taking all those hours and minutes, trying to figure out when the start time is. So if we're now, well, here now is start. But then, hey, if it's now, when do we end based upon that? So now begins when we're starting the maintenance window, and then how many minutes from now or how many hours from now is the end time? Because when we come into process, we need to know when we start and when we end. So that's what all this code does, is basically when does it begin and when you end, and then we're going to set that in SolarWinds. So that's kind of the fun thing. But I need to write this huge block so that when I first start off, I know exactly what I'm going to do with all the pieces, so that when I take all the computer names, so all of these, once I say 4 hours, it's going to define when my begin and when my end is, and for each server as I come along. So I want to quickly define at the very beginning what I'm doing, so that I can do that based upon each item that comes in the pipeline. So this is a pretty intensive, but I think it's, now that we understand what's happening, you can then take this code and kind of massage it into what we're looking for, because I don't even end. And then at the very end, here's the new alias. But all right, so I'm hoping that everybody kind of understood most of that and took you from, hey, reading a simple function to writing even something as can be complex as this. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to me on Twitter. You could also ask questions now. Open up your mics if you want. PowerShell in action. Yeah, there's a bunch of YouTube videos out there. Jeff Hicks does some stuff. This code actually will be posted up onto my GitHub in the presentations repository. So if you have any questions, actually you can go back to the presentation. So this PowerShell or this GitHub repo, there will be a, so I am going to post it up here later on. So later on tonight, there'll be a New York PowerShell here, and I want to push that up there. So if you want this code, you're free to have it. You can certainly reach out to me on Twitter, or you can go and fork that code from there and get a copy.
Hey, that was great, Phil. Yeah, and when I post the video, I will put all that stuff in the description in the YouTube links, and I'll post that again here. So if you want to subscribe to that channel, it's great. That was a great presentation, really deep, really informative on how functions work, all of the nitty-gritty pieces. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. We'll catch you next time. Have a good holiday. See you in the new year.